Hi and welcome back. Today I'll be painting this dramatic summer sky with clouds blowing in across distant hills with a lake and a sort of misty moorland foreground. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed £90 paper. It's quarter imperial size. I've got it taped to my board and my board is at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees. I haven't pre-stretched my paper. It will usually buckle a bit as I'm painting, but as it dries naturally, it flattens out completely. I'm using my new Pro Arte Ron Ranson hake brush. It's a size large. I'm just trying it out for the first time. I'm going to use it to wet the sky all over. I want to do a nice sort of wet in wet sky, and I want to try and get I want it to be a blue sky, but I want some nice dramatic shadowy clouds too. I'm going to just take away from the sort of glaring white of the paper with a little bit of raw sienna across the page, and then I'm going to mix up a mixture of sepia, indigo and paynes grey unevenly on the brush so that I can then just fill in that top corner in a sort of a random way that gives me a nice random mixture of different colours depending on which part of the brush that I use. And I'm just sort of loosely scribbling in a way across the page, leaving some white gaps for clouds and hoping for some nice dramatic shapes and nice soft diffusions from the wet in wet technique that I'm using here. I'm trying to keep it nice and pale towards the horizon because I want to put in some distant hills once it's dry. Just maybe try and darken up the top just a little bit more, just in the corner, to keep that sort of cloud bank looking nice and brooding, as if it's being blown in. Maybe an oncoming rain shower or something like that. Now with a clean damp brush, I'm just going to take off that bead of water along the horizon line where the water has run down through gravity down the wet page, because I don't want that pooling up there too much. Now I'm just going to use the clean damp brush just to move a little bit of paint around and try and get some smaller shaped clouds that look as if they're right in the distance, so that the sky has sort of some perspective in it. And I'm just going to dip in here and there and just soften back slightly here and there, just hoping to, as I say, emphasize the perspective of the clouds as they blow in from a distance. Trying to get a sky that looks as if it's got some perspective in it helps if you're trying to paint quite a large, long distance panoramic scene. Just touching in a little bit more blue in that area. The sky is still wet, the paper still has a nice sheen on it, so it's safe for me to play around with the sky a little bit more, but I don't want to do too much more to it, otherwise it might get overworked. Now I'm just putting across a thin sweep of raw sienna, indigo and the paynes grey and sepia, but quite a weak bluish mixture across the background, and that will start off my distant hills. Now dipping in for various sweeps of the colours, the same colours as in the sky, I'm just going to bring across the shape of the land in a shallow diagonal from right across to left, and just putting in some different colours and shades and tones and textures, leaving white unpainted paper at the moment across the back running towards the left, which is going to be a lake eventually. Just maybe putting in some darks. I think I've got a bit too much sepia on my brush there, but let's carry on and see how it looks. I can always lighten that up a little bit, but I'm just going to keep building up this foreground area a little bit more. Maybe dropping in some darks and then putting in some paler paint in places. I just want it to look like something and nothing, really. Just going to put in some darker Paynes grey here and there, just to sort of start off some areas of foreground scrubland grasses, marshy grasses, that sort of thing. Just going to take a clean damp flat brush, 3/4 inch flat brush, and just try and sort of smooth out underneath that horizon line a little tiny bit. I'm just going to use the card to scrape up through the thick paint in the foreground, this thick dark Paynes grey, and just scrape up the shape of some sort of reeds and marsh grasses and things like that. Just bring them through across the tape and into the painting, just to establish a bit more detail in the foreground. Just put in a few more darks with the tips of the brush. That's some sepia and some Paynes grey going in there, and then maybe a few more little scratches of the marsh grass. I'm not sure if I like that. I think I might have gone in a little bit too dark there, but we'll see how it dries. Because of course watercolour always dries back quite a bit lighter. I think I want to just smooth out some of those darker marks in the midground there. I want this to look more like just sort of misty distance. I don't want the eye to get caught by it too much. I want the eye to be led up, hopefully through from the front, from the foreground, across to the distant hills, but then up to the sky. Ultimately, this is a sky painting, and I don't want the land to compete too much with the sky in this case. Just a bit of dry brush across the lake, just to establish a little bit of shadow and sparkle across there before I let it dry. Just pull together across the foreground, smooth it out a little bit. I think that's about all I want to do. I think now I'm going to just let it dry completely and then come back and see how it looks, and then move on with the distant hills. It's completely dry now, so I'm taking my flat brush, and I've got a sort of fairly weak mixture of indigo, Paynes grey, and a little bit of the sepia in it. So it's sort of slightly bluish tone. I'm using my flat brush to create some just long, narrow, distant hills across the very background. Trying to keep them quite gentle in shape, and to not make them too large, too deep, if you know what I mean. I think keeping them quite narrow like this implies that they're really far away, so it's giving us then a good sense of depth and distance. Keeping it nice and pale like this as well gives us our aerial perspective, which then also enhances the look of the illusion of distance here. And with the tips of the flat brush, I'm just going to dot in a little tiny bit of darker paint just along that bottom edge, because then that will just give us the look of sort of shadows and maybe a hint of trees in the very far distance at the base of the hills. And just a little bit more across the base of that hill on this side here. Now it's dried back and hasn't lightened up, and I'm not very keen on this front bit, but I'm going to try and change it. So I'm going to dab water all over that dark area that I don't like, that's really distracting. Leave it for a second or so and then dab it off and see if that will help. That looks a lot better actually. It's got rid of that black mark, which was a huge mistake really. I'll just do the same a little bit further along and just lighten up that front area a little bit more. If you're careful, you can often do this and just dab out with clean water and a tissue, dab out certain areas and then rework them. And I think I've just about managed to get away with that, and I like it a lot better now. And I'll pull out a little bit of the dark across the midground where it got a bit too dark too. Well, I think that's a great improvement for this mid stage of the painting. I can do a bit more detail across the front now that I've lightened it up a bit. Now on to the next thing I want to do is to put a bit of the sky colour, that blue, into the lake. So I'm just going to try and keep it as simple as possible, and a fairly weak mixture of indigo and a little bit of the Paynes grey in it, just across in the lake there. And I think that will do nicely. Now I just missed out a tiny bit of filming there where I just took that dark bead of water across the bottom of the lake and softened it off slightly. Now I'm going to use a combination of a number 1 rigger brush and a small Chinese calligraphy brush, and mostly indigo with a little bit of sepia in it, to just put in some strands of marsh grass or plants and maybe some little wildflowers and things like that, just in the very foreground. And I'm going to do this through a combination of curved thin lines for stems and stalks and reeds and things made with the rigger, and then I'm going to use the Chinese calligraphy brush to sort of dot and dash, just to create a loose impression of groups of flowers, or seed heads or anything like that, just sort of waving in the breeze in the foreground. Just a little tiny bit of detail in the foreground, I think, should just be enough to tie things together. Trying to make sure that I keep my marks fairly random but still in the kind of patterns that can be seen as impressions of flowers. And my groups of plants, reeds and flowers are bending over from sort of right to left, which is the same kind of direction as the sky. The clouds look as if they're blowing across from the right of the picture across towards the left, and so I'm trying to keep up that same sort of directional push within the painting, so that it looks as if this is a common direction across this landscape for the wind to blow, so that the plants are kind of growing in this kind of direction. I hope I explained that okay. I'm going to put another slightly smaller group of the same plants and flowers just a little bit further along towards the right. And I'll just keep going backwards and forwards from one little group of plants to the other, and from the rigger brush to the calligraphy brush, just until I feel like I've achieved some sort of a balance, and I feel that the plants look convincing enough, but hopefully without being too overworked. just some slightly stronger stem type marks there. And you can take your time when you're painting in details like this, just to make sure you get them looking right, because there's no hurry, because it's just wet paint painted onto a dry painting, so I can stop and look and think about whether I think I've painted enough in or whether I need just a little bit more to balance the composition. Of course, you can paint as many or as few as you like. You could put in some trees. There's all kinds of possibilities here. Next, I'm just going to use a clean damp flat brush. I'm just going to pull it across underneath those distant hills, just to create a sort of one extra very fine line, to flatten out the sort of horizon a little bit, but also just to add a little bit more like depth and detail and a bit more definition to that. The last thing I'm going to do is just paint in a few birds in the sky. Not many, just a few, and try and get them sort of looking like they're kind of wheeling in a sort of direction into the wind. I'm using my fine rigger. I think it's a number 1 rigger, and my mixture of paint is indigo Paynes grey, and it's quite an inky consistency. And I'm just going to put a few birds in, not too many. I'm going to make some of them a little bit smaller, so it looks as if some of them are a bit further back into the distance. If you paint them in, if you think they're a bit dark, while the paint's still wet, you can just gently dab with a tissue and they'll lighten up a little bit. So that's it. That's the painting finished. I'm going to peel off the masking tape and see how it looks with a nice clean white border. Being careful to pull the tape away from the painting so that if it was to catch and tear, it wouldn't tear into the painting. Now I think that's okay. I quite like that, considering I was nearly ready to throw it away halfway through when I put that all that Paynes grey paint in the foreground by mistake, and it got really dark. I'm quite pleased with it. I like the lovely wet in wet diffusions of paint in the sky. I think it works really, really well. That's why I love this method of painting so much. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And if you're not already a subscriber, it would be lovely if you could click on the subscribe button and the bell icon, and then you'll be notified whenever I post a video. So thanks again so much for watching, and thanks to my lovely patrons on Patreon who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.